The city of Ravenwood never truly slept. Beneath the flickering neon lights and towering skyscrapers, its justice system was rotten to the core. Cases weren't decided in the courtroom. They were settled over lavish dinners with top-shelf whiskey and discreet handshakes. And at the center of it all, Judge Victor Holloway wasn't just a man upholding the law. He was the one pulling the strings for those who held real power, wealthy tycoons and corrupt officers. Amidst the chaos, Gabrielle Carter was one of the few who still believed in justice. A brilliant black attorney, she had won cases that seemed impossible. But fighting in a city like Ravenwood wasn't just about the law, it was about survival. Gabrielle knew that all too well. She had received anonymous calls, threatening letters, and even noticed a black SUV silently tailing her on the way home. But she never backed down. While Gabrielle stood for justice, Police Chief Dean Mercer embodied everything rotten about the city. He didn't just protect criminals, he fabricated evidence and destroyed the lives of those who dared to oppose him. When the case of James Whitaker, a former Marine accused of murder, began gaining attention, Gabrielle could smell the stench of a setup. But what she didn't know was that this time, she wasn't just up against a wrongful conviction. She was up against an entire system designed to crush anyone who dared to challenge it. The courtroom was suffocating. Not from the summer heat creeping through the grand stained-glass windows of Ravenwood's courthouse, but from the weight of corruption that had settled into its walls like an unshakable disease. Gabrielle Carter stood at the defense table, her hands gripping the polished oak surface as she studied the jury. 12 pairs of eyes, some filled with doubt, others carefully neutral, waited for her to speak. Across the room, James Whitaker, a former Marine with a commendable service record, sat with his shoulders squared, his jaw clenched tight. A man trained to fight for his country, now reduced to a scapegoat for a crime he didn't commit. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Lucas Grayson, had painted him as a violent killer, a man who snapped and left a young woman dead in an alley. The so-called evidence? A blurry security camera image, a knife found near the scene, conveniently bearing partial prints, and the testimony of a supposed eyewitness who had already changed their story twice. Gabrielle had seen cases like this before. Cases where the accused had no real chance because the system had already decided their fate. And she knew exactly who was behind it. Judge Victor Holloway, presiding over the case with his cold, calculating gaze, had a reputation for tipping the scales in favor of those with power. And Police Chief Dean Mercer? He was the architect of it all, ensuring that men like James Whitaker never saw justice, especially when their freedom threatened to expose something bigger. Gabrielle took a steady breath and stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice firm but composed, "James Whitaker served this country with honor. He risked his life for people he had never met, people just like you. And now this system, the very one he fought to protect, is trying to discard him like he's nothing." She let the words settle, watching the jury shift uncomfortably. The prosecution wants you to believe their narrative because it's easy. But the truth? The truth is messy. And it's dangerous, to the people who don't want it exposed. She glanced at Adia Grayson, who leaned back in his chair, smirking. He wasn't worried. Not yet. Holloway was still in control. But Gabrielle wasn't finished. She turned and walked toward the evidence table, picking up the forensic report. The knife found at the scene, partial prints, no DNA match to my client. A security camera image so unclear, you couldn't identify your own family in it. And an eyewitness who, under oath, admitted to being threatened into testifying. She paused. "Now tell me, does that sound like justice?" Silence. Judge Holloway cleared his throat. "Miss Carter, let's not waste the jury's time with dramatics." Gabrielle met his gaze, unflinching. "The only thing wasting this jury's time is a system too afraid to admit it made a mistake." She knew this case wasn't just about James Whitaker. It was about exposing the entire rotten foundation of Ravenwood's justice system. And she wasn't stopping until the whole city saw the truth. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating, a slow-burning fire threatening to erupt into chaos. Gabrielle Carter knew she was pushing her luck, but she didn't care. The truth had been buried for too long, and she wasn't about to let her client, James Whitaker, become another casualty of a corrupt system. Judge Victor Holloway's eyes burned with silent warning as he banged his gavel. "Miss Carter, you are treading dangerously close to contempt." Gabrielle straightened her spine, her expression unreadable. "And this court is treading dangerously close to convicting an innocent man." Across the room, Adia Lucas Grayson smirked, his confidence unwavering. He had seen defense attorneys try and fail before. The game was rigged and he held the winning cards. Or so he thought. Since you're so intent on discussing truth, Miss Carter, Grayson said smoothly, rising from his chair, perhaps we should remind the jury of the evidence that places Mr. Whitaker at the scene of the crime. He turned to the jury, his voice dripping with practiced persuasion. A witness places him there. His military background speaks to a history of violence. And let's not forget the weapon. That has no conclusive ties to him, Gabrielle cut in. Grayson's smirk faltered for half a second before he recovered. Desperation doesn't suit you, Miss Carter? Gabrielle didn't respond. Instead, she walked toward the defense table, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Your Honor, before we proceed further, I'd like to submit new evidence into the record. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Grayson frowned, exchanging a glance with Judge Holloway. This is highly irregular, Holloway said, though his voice lacked its usual authority. What evidence? Gabrielle reached into her briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. This, Your Honor, is a forensic analysis conducted by an independent investigator, one not affiliated with Ravenwood PD. She walked to the bailiff, handing him the file. It proves that the knife found at the scene has been tampered with. Partial prints were added after the fact. And not just any prints, ones belonging to my client. Grayson shot to his feet. Objection. This is absurd. Gabrielle turned to face him, her eyes blazing. What's absurd, Mr. Grayson, is that your so-called evidence was manufactured. She looked back at the judge. If the prosecution truly believes in justice, then they should have no problem allowing this report to be examined. The courtroom was dead silent. Even the jury looked unsettled now. Holloway hesitated, an unusual sight for a man so used to control. Grayson clenched his jaw. He knew this wasn't over. Gabrielle had just thrown a live grenade into his case, and the explosion was coming. And Gabrielle? She knew this was just the beginning. Judge Holloway, ADA Grayson, Police Chief Dean Mercer. They had built their power on lies and intimidation. But now, for the first time, cracks were starting to form. And she was going to tear the whole damn system down. The storm outside mirrored the tension brewing in the courtroom. Rain pounded against the high windows, casting streaks of water down the glass. But Gabrielle Carter didn't flinch. She sat tall at the defense table, her hands folded neatly, her expression calm. Too calm. Across the aisle, ADA Lucas Grayson gripped the edge of his table, his frustration barely concealed behind a tight smile. He had underestimated her, and now the weight of that mistake was pressing down on him like a vice. Judge Victor Holloway cleared his throat, breaking the silence. Miss Carter, you understand the severity of the accusations you're making? His voice was measured, but there was an edge to it, a warning. Gabrielle met his gaze, unwavering. I do, Your Honor. That's why I intend to prove them. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The jury shifted in their seats, their eyes darting between the defense and prosecution. They had been confident in Whitaker's guilt an hour ago. Now, doubt hung in the air like a thick fog. Grayson leaned forward, his voice dripping with forced patience. You're accusing an entire police department of fabricating evidence. Do you understand how ridiculous that sounds? Gabrielle tilted her head. Not as ridiculous as convicting an innocent man based on lies. Before Grayson could retort, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A tall woman strode inside, her dark trench coat dripping from the rain, her sharp eyes scanning the room like a hawk assessing its prey. Special Agent Naomi Steele. A ripple of recognition went through the crowd. Even Holloway's composure faltered for a moment. Your Honor, Gabrielle said, turning slightly toward the agent. With the court's permission, I'd like to introduce new testimony. Agent Steele has been leading a quiet investigation into the Ravenwood PD for the past 6 months. What she's uncovered is directly relevant to this case. Grayson's jaw clenched. Objection. This is a stunt. Holloway held up a hand, silencing him. His gaze lingered on Steele for a beat too long before he exhaled. I'll allow it. Steele stepped forward, her every movement precise. She removed a flash drive from her pocket and handed it to the bailiff. This contains audio recordings, financial transactions, and internal communications that prove widespread corruption within the department. Including the falsification of evidence in multiple cases, Mr. Whitaker's among them. A collective gasp filled the courtroom. Gabrielle allowed herself the smallest smile. The first domino had just fallen. Grayson stood, his mask of confidence cracking. This is outrageous. Your Honor, we can't just. Holloway's gavel came down with a sharp bang. Enough, Mr. Grayson. His voice was quieter now, as if he could feel the walls closing in. He turned back to Gabrielle. Proceed. Gabrielle leaned forward. Thank you, Your Honor. Then she turned to the jury, her voice steady but commanding. The system failed my client. But it's not just about him. It's about every person who has suffered under the weight of corruption, who has been silenced by fear. Today that changes. She locked eyes with Grayson. The battle was far from over, but the tide had turned. And she was just getting started. The courtroom was no longer just a battleground, it was a reckoning. Gabrielle Carter had forced the prosecution into a corner, and now they were scrambling. ADA Lucas Grayson, once confident, now looked like a man trying to plug holes in a sinking ship. Special Agent Naomi Steele's revelations had sent shockwaves through the courtroom, and the jury was no longer looking at Whitaker as a criminal. They were looking at him as a victim. Judge Victor Holloway adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable, but Gabrielle knew what was happening behind those sharp eyes. He was weighing the gravity of the moment. A case like this didn't just end in a verdict, it ignited something far bigger. Grayson stood, his voice tight. Your Honor, we request an immediate recess to review this new evidence. Gabrielle expected this. Your Honor, the prosecution has had weeks to review their so-called evidence, and yet they failed to uncover the truth. My client does not have the luxury of time. He has already spent months in a jail cell for a crime he didn't commit. The truth is right in front of us. The jury deserves to hear it now. Holloway studied her, then turned to Steele. Agent Steele, are you prepared to testify under oath regarding the authenticity of these documents? Steele's gaze was steady. I am, Your Honor. The judge exhaled sharply. Then, with a decisive nod, he turned to the bailiff. Swear in the witness. Gabrielle sat back, her heartbeat steady. She had spent her career fighting for justice, but this was different. This was war. And she had no intention of losing. Gabrielle Carter's story is not just a legal battle. It's a powerful reminder of the value of truth and justice. In a society where power can be abused and the truth can be distorted, courage and perseverance are the strongest weapons. Gabrielle wasn't just fighting for her client, she was fighting for those without a voice, for those the system had turned its back on. The key lesson here is, never accept injustice as the norm. Ask questions, seek the truth, and most importantly, speak up. In life, no matter the field, integrity and determination will always be guiding lights. Justice may be delayed, but it can never be denied if there are people brave enough to stand up and fight for it.